All right, we're going to jump right into the history of pharmacy and healthcare. I know you guys get history of medicine in several classes. This one is more about the history of pharmacy, although it will cross over into some of the medicine. So if you recall correctly, medicine used to be based in magic and religion. So if you didn't get well, it's because you didn't pray hard enough, or the evil demons, couldn't be exorcised from your body. And way, way, way back, they used to think that if you had a headache, it was because you had a demon in your head, so they would drill holes in your skull to let the demon out. So luckily, we've come a long way since then. Okay. The Sumerians, around 4000 BC, we talked about the demons thing. They studied the stars and animal intestines to determine their course in life and what the cause of illnesses was, and just a little bit of everything. In many cultures, the physicians were priests. So remember that the priests were doctors, it wasn't a separate profession back then. In 3000 BC, we had Imhotep, who was the Egyptian god of medicine. He's the first physician that we know by name, but he didn't become the god of medicine until after his death. So it was kind of a posthumous title. These Greek words are so difficult for me to say. Asclepius, I don't know. He's long dead. He was the Greek god of medicine, who was killed by Zeus because he raised Hippolytus from the dead and accepted gold for it. So he was paid for doing this. His daughter, Panacea, became the goddess of medicinal herbs. The rod of Asclepius is the snake entwined staff, so that's what we get here. That's where our symbol, our medicine symbol, comes from. Okay. There was kind of a cult following for him, but that was not necessarily a bad thing, because those centers where they practiced medicine became training grounds. So they kind of became educational centers, even though they started out as treatment centers. In addition to demons or whatever, we started looking at the natural world. So homeopathic or naturopathic medicines have been around forever and ever and ever. They've enjoyed a resurgence in popularity in the last few years, but we've been using plant and plant derivatives for a long time. Our drugs come from various sources. They can be classified as natural, which means they came from plant sources. So the Sumerians actually used about 250 medicines derived from plants. Some of those medicines have changed form, but the roots are still back in what the Sumerians were using. Okay. Shen Nung Pao So used 365 herbs for health treatment. This is the first trial and error drug testing that we have on record. So here, try this, did that work? No. Okay, here, let's try this formulation, did that work? No, that kind of thing. Synthetic just means created artificially. Most of our drugs today are synthetic drugs, but they're based on a natural chemical. Synthesized are created artificially, but they're imitation of naturally occurring substances. And semi-synthetic contain both natural and synthetic components. So it's a combination of the two. Shen Yun was the Chinese emperor who found hundreds of herbal medicines. He tasted plants and natural materials to determine which were poisonous and which were beneficial, that trial and error that I talked about just a second ago. Brave man, testing things. Don't know if it's going to kill him, but test it, see if it works. Okay. We don't know, but it is assumed that Shen Yung is the author of the Divine Husbandman's Materia Medica, which is the Chinese pharmacopoeia. Okay, 365 medicines are listed in that are derived from minerals, plants, and animals. So that's, that's a pretty healthy amount of medications. Okay, Papyrus Ebers, we saw around 1500 BC, wrote about 800 prescriptions using 700 drugs, most of them for plants. And that was about an 1100 page scroll. So it also was a big piece of work. As far as we know, it is the most complete record of ancient Egyptian medicine and pharmacology. So some of the things that he had listed would be prescriptions for asthma, a mixture of herbs heated on a brick so that the sufferer could inhale their fumes. Okay. For a bellyache, the evacuation of the belly, cow's milk, grains, honey. You take their 1:1:1 ratio, mash, sift it, cook it, and take in 4 portions. Oh, that sounds awful. And then with birth control, now this one I'm not sure works so well. To prevent conception, smear a paste of date, acacia, and honey to wool and apply as necessary. I'm not quite sure. Oh, apply as a pessary. I was like, whoa. I'm not quite sure that dates, acacia, and honey really are that effective. We'll talk about a different method here in a little bit that was a little bit more effective. Okay, we should all be familiar with Hippocrates. He proposed that disease came from natural occurring things, not supernatural causes, which was that was a big change from what the previous thousands of years had taught people. So he diagnosed illnesses based on careful scientific observation of the patient condition. But what is interesting about Hippocrates is that he also believed that it was natural. He believed illnesses and injuries came from natural sources, but he also believed that the body could heal itself. Most of the time, if somebody got injured, if they broke a leg, the leg would heal. Could we make it heal better? You bet. We could use splints and casts and materials like that. But as a general rule, the body will heal itself. And that's something that he firmly believed in. But he was not opposed to using other things to help the body heal itself. Okay. After Hippocrates, the approach to medicine changed a little bit, which I think is amazing because we went from magic and demons to, oh, what's going on here? Natural causes. We started to examine things scientifically. And once we had proof, scientific proof, people started believing that that was how illness happened. And then we started treating people based on the science they had at the time. Okay. So they saw the disease as a loss of the body's equilibrium rather than a work of the gods. And we still use this premise now because everything works in homeostasis. Remember, we talk about homeostasis in other classes, that our body strives to be in balance. And when we're not in balance, things go awry. In this case, if our immune system is not in balance, we get sick. Okay, so we still use this principle in modern times. And we just have a fancy name for it. Okay. The Hippocratic Oath is an oath historically taken by physicians and other healthcare professionals swearing to practice medicine ethically and honestly. Okay. It is believed to have been written by Hippocrates, who we think of as the father of Western medicine, or by one of his students. Whether he wrote it or one of his students wrote it, the name Hippocratic Oath comes from his name. It's an eponym. Remember that eponyms are things that are named for a person, okay? The oath is considered a rite of passage for practitioners of medicine in many countries. So it's not just the US where our physicians take a Hippocratic oath. It's it's worldwide. Okay. This is a version of the Hippocratic Oath from 1964. You guys can go ahead and read that on your own PowerPoint. Okay. King Mithridates, something like that, 100 BC. There's some conflicting information about immunizations, but he took small amounts of poisons to build up a tolerance to them, okay? What he did was he would take a little bit each day, his body adjusted to it, he developed a tolerance, and then he tried to commit suicide, but couldn't because he'd built this tolerance to that poison. Now, do we know that this is probably a bad idea, that, you know, poisoning yourself to build tolerance to poison is maybe not the best idea? But 100 BC, I don't know what was crossing his mind, but he tried, okay? He used methyldracium, which has like 65 ingredients, for 150 years to promote health. I don't know how it promoted health, but it lasted for a long time, okay? And that evolved a little bit through time. So from 100 BC until 1786, we were still using methyldrate, which is a derivative of his antidote. So that lasted a long time. I was trying to do the math in my head, but I can't. So that was about 1800 years that methyldrate was being used. Okay. Dioscorides, 77 BC, was a Greek physician. He wrote the first actual manual on drugs, De Materia Medica, and we used his manual or his text for about 1600 years. We know that opium comes from poppies, and he, of course, described that in his textbook. This may also be called the pharmacopoeia, and you can actually find, if you go to Barnes and Nobles, you can find pharmacopoeias of natural medicine and all of that kind of stuff in their, I want to say, outdoor sections. It might be in both outdoor and in medicine. They will have a book, pharmacopoeia of natural medications or plants and their derivatives, which is kind of cool. So it's a book containing directions for the identification of samples and preparation of compound medicines. And like I said, you can go to Barnes and Noble and pick one up. Hippocrates in Dioscorides wrote about the pain-relieving ability of bark, which is aspirin. Well, aspirin is the derivative of the bark. So a white willow tree grew in the Mediterranean. Years later, we figured out, so they would strip the bark and boil it up and drink it as a tea. When I was in college, I was taking a biology class, like a wildlife biology class, and they had determined that animals like elk and deer would rub their antlers on willow and aspen trees. And we used to think that they were marking their territory that way. Well, it turns out that by rubbing their budding antlers on the trees, that they were actually just grinding in the salicylate or the pain medication right into those nubs. So I guess that makes sense, that the animals, rather than marking their territory, were just trying to get some relief from the erupting antlers. And I don't know how the wildlife biologists figured that out, but they did, and it makes way more sense than in a prey animal marking their territory. Let's see. 2,000 years later, they found the active ingredient and called it salicylic acid. Now we use acetyl salicylic acid as aspirin. That's why the abbreviation for aspirin is ASA, because it's acetyl salicylic acid. Okay. It is bitter, bitter, bitter. So aspirin is developed synthetically, but if you've ever chewed up even synthetic aspirin, it is nasty. But it works, okay? It is the most widely used drug in the world. We use it for pain control, fever control, and to prevent clots in people who are at risk cardiovascularly. The one thing we do not do is give aspirin to infants because it can cause Reye's syndrome. But otherwise, we use it for lots and lots of things. Okay. And so there's the willow trees. Okay. The Charaka Samhita is the great book of Indian medicine. Okay, so we were talked about Greek and Egyptian. This is Indian medicine. There are 500 drugs that are described in here. We've talked about Galen in other courses. He's the Greek physician who is the greatest name since Hippocrates. He established the theory of humors. So we had black bile, yellow bile, phlegm, and blood. He also advocated bleeding, which we know is maybe not the best thing in the world to do. If you remember that from our phlebotomy classes and hematology classes. But the reason he was doing that is that's really the only humor we could readily access. Can't get black bile, yellow bile. I suppose you can get phlegm, but not as readily as blood. And what he was trying to do was go back to homeostasis, try to bring the body back in balance. He did conduct animal experiments. We've talked about this, I think, in Med 100. We talked about the animal experiments, and then he applied them to human. Well, mammals are similar. You can't really study a pig or a cow. Let's go with a cow because they've got 4 stomachs. Can't really study a cow and apply all of that information to human. Yes, there's a lot of crossovers in mammals, but it's not exact. Okay. He did come up with a classification of drugs for treatment of disease. He did emphasize education, observation, and logic, even though we find his logic not so logical now. At the time, it was groundbreaking stuff. Okay. That education, observation, and logic truly is the cornerstone for Western medicine. Now we have the Book of Medicine dedicated to Mansur, which came out in the Middle Ages. It's written by Persian Reis, who was an alchemist who believed he could turn lesser metal into gold. So he thought he could take lead and turn it into gold. You can't really do that. Okay. When he failed to do this, he was ordered to have his head beaten by his book until either his head or the book broke. Okay. Neither occurred. He did lose sight in one eye, probably due to the traumatic brain injury from being beaten about his head with the book. So he lost sight in one eye, but he did continue his work. Even though he could not turn metal into gold, he did actually help out in the practice of pharmacy because he compiled texts. So he developed things like mortars, flasks, spatulas, vials that we were using. And we actually still use mortars and flasks, and we still use all of that stuff when we're making medications now. And then Avicenna is another physician whose writing dominated the medical thinking in Europe for centuries, lots of them. Okay. Paracelsus in 1500 AD was a Swiss alchemist He did not believe in the four humors, despite Galen having a big stronghold with that. He wasn't quite sold on it, but he did believe in Hippocrates. So he is credited with the use of chemistry to create medicinal drugs. For this class, that's super important, don't you think, to know who is credited with using chemistry? He published the first recipe for laudanum. Okay, laudanum worked very, very well, but oh boy, was it abused. Laudanum contains almost all of the opiates. Morphine and codeine had a high morphine concentration. I don't know how more people did not die using laudanum, because all of those opiates are CNS depressants, the central nervous system depressants, and they can really inhibit breathing and heart rate. But I don't know how people just didn't keel over dead from them. Okay, we used to use laudanum for everything. Primarily, it was used as an analgesic, so pain medication, and a cough suppressant. Okay, until early 20th century, it was sold without a prescription. You could just go to the apothecary and buy laudanum. Okay. A lot of our patent medicines, which we haven't talked about yet, but we will talk about patent medicines in the future. You could just go buy this massive opioid liquid and use it as needed. So it was being used by parents for their kids, people with TB, because it was a good cough suppressant. Well, it's a good cough suppressant because it's a CNS depressant. So it's actually deadening your body's response to the tickle or the cough. Okay, it is strongly addictive, which we know, and it's strictly regulated now. But through the 1800s, early 1900s, you could just go buy some laudanum. You wanted your kids to sleep for the night, give them a hit of laudanum, they'd sleep all night. Okay. So these are all the different forms that you would see. It's incredible that this top one, 45.5 grains of opium in 40% alcohol. Why people did not just keel over and die is beyond me. The Indians of Mexico, about 1500 AD, the Indians were using about 1,200 drugs when the Spanish invaders came and found them. They used the sarsaparilla plant, which then became popular in Europe, because remember the Spanish were from Europe. For kidney and bladder ailments, you could use the root for medicinal purposes, and we still use these in teas today. So here in the American Old West, sarsaparilla was the most popular drink of the cowboys. This stuff is nasty. You can still buy like a sarsaparilla soda up at Rocket Fizz in Old Town Fort Collins, and it's nasty. I don't know how it became so popular in the Old West. Well, I guess they didn't have much to choose from as far as drinks, because anything alcoholic was basically turpentine, and you could set places on fire with it, or water. So I guess it had some flavor, but it's pretty nasty. Okay. Around 1630 AD, we had a treatment for malaria, and we know that malaria is caused by the Plasmodium parasite, and we get it from bites of infected mosquitoes. So when an infected mosquito bites someone, the parasite lives in the mosquito's saliva, so when they bite, it transfers the saliva to the human, and then that parasite enters the human, multiplies in the liver, and infects the red blood cells. We still have a huge problem with malaria in developing countries. We've been treating it for hundreds of years, but the parasites have developed a resistance to the medication. So, they're looking for a way to live. they're adapting, and we still can't seem to wipe out malaria. Our first medicine was cinchona for the bark of a Peruvian tree. Our current medicine that we use is quinine, and it can make you very, very sick. We had an instructor here a few years ago who went on a medical mission to a place that had malaria, and the medication that she had to take to avoid getting malaria made her very, very sick. And I guess everybody in her traveling party was sick because of the drugs. However, would you rather be sick because of the drugs or be sick because of malaria that, you know, we may or may not be able to treat because they are resistant? Okay. The smallpox vaccine, we've heard different stories about where it came apart or where it came from. Remember scab sniffing? The Chinese were doing scab sniffing. That would have been, I think, Med 100, you talked about scab sniffing. But they would grind up the smallpox scabs, and then they would snort them. And that was how the Chinese were treating or preventing smallpox. But in 1721, we have Dr. Zabdiel Boylston, who was the first person to administer a smallpox vaccine that we would now consider a vaccine, not sniffing somebody's nasty old ground up scabs. Okay. He had gotten the disease earlier, and he inoculated his 6-year-old son and 2 slaves, who then developed mild cases, but they recovered. So this really lends credence to, if we expose the body to the disease, but it's a weakened form of it, the body will respond, make antibodies, and then you'll be protected after that. Okay. He did vaccinate 249 people, and only 6 died, which is, you know, 6 is a significant amount, but not as much as the people who died who were not inoculated. So let me do the math here real quick, maybe. So of the people who were inoculated, that he inoculated, only 2% died. If you got it naturally, the death rate was, sorry, I'm doing my math here, 14%. So even though a few people died from the vaccine, it was a way smaller percentage than people who got the disease. So 14% of the people who got the disease died. That's a pretty significant thing. In 1796, we have Edward Jenner, who successfully developed the vaccine from cowpox. There's a couple of videos on here I want you guys to watch about the smallpox vaccine. It's pretty cool. We eradicated smallpox in 1949. In 1972, we quit routinely vaccinating against it in the United States. Okay. The World Health Organization certified that smallpox had been eradicated from the planet in 1980. However, there are still, we've had no naturally occurring cases. However, there are still parts of the world where you will get a smallpox vaccine. A lot of military have had smallpox vaccines, and a lot of families who have lived abroad will still get smallpox vaccines. I had a girl when I was working in family practice. She was about 16 years old. She was really young, far too young to have been routinely vaccinated. And the smallpox vaccine scar is pretty obvious. It's usually up on the upper deltoid, either the right or the left deltoid, and it kind of looks like a cheese grater mark. So I was surprised when I saw this kid, she's a 16-year-old girl, who had a smallpox scar, and I asked her about it. And it was because her parents were in the military and they were living in a place, I don't even remember where they were living, that they were still recommended to get the smallpox vaccine. So we are still vaccinating. It's just pretty sporadic and only in specific areas of the world. Okay. So yeah, this is how they were inoculating it. It's not an injection. It's a piercing of the skin and then using the smallpox serum in that pierced area of the skin. Foxglove, excuse me, was our first heart medicine. We found it in 1785 AD. And the active ingredient in this foxglove is digitalis. We use digitalis all the time for heart disease. The actual name now is digoxin, but that's we use it quite often for heart disease. Okay. We use it for things like atrial fibrillation. So just an interesting tidbit, President Bush was on DIG for AFib. Just a couple of other things that are important. Frederick Serturner was the first to extract morphine from opium, which sounds like it's a really good thing, but that actually started the opioid crisis. And we actually have a video that we'll watch in class on Thursday about this. Okay. Before the 1800s, if you had surgery, there was no such thing as anesthesia. They would hold you down, cut you open, do the surgery, whatever they needed to do, but it was done without anesthesia. In 1846, though, in Boston, there was the first surgery using general anesthesia. At that time, we were using ether as the anesthetic. We know that ether is dangerous. A lot of people died using ether, but at the time, I don't know, ether or being held down while you cut me open. Ether or, for me, that's a no-brainer. Ether me up. Okay. Louis Pasteur, we talk about him a lot in Med 104, I believe, in microbiology class. He's the reason that we use autoclaves, okay? He showed that heat can be used to kill microorganisms associated with food spoilage and can be used to preserve the food. So any of you guys who do any canning, we have two types of canning. We've got water bath canning, which we can use for acidic foods. We put the food in a jar, we seal it, we put it in a water bath, cover it with so that there's more than an inch of water covering everything, and we boil it until, well, however long the cookbook says to boil it. I usually do about 20 minutes because I want everything dead. So we can use the water bath canning, and that is directly related to Louis Pasteur. Or we can use pressure canning, which is essentially what our autoclaves are. So with pressure canning and with autoclaves, we put something in a pressurized vessel. We bring the heat and the steam up, and we not only rise the temperature of whatever we're autoclaving, but we're increasing the pressure as well. So we're killing things in multiple ways that way. Okay. We had the germ theory of disease, and not everybody bought into germ theory, and we used Koch's principles for that. I think we talked about Koch's principles in Med 104. So these two, Pasteur and Robert Koch, kind of supported each other with their studies. I don't know that they were like buddy supporting each other, but that their research inadvertently supported each other's theories. Okay. Pasteur disproved spontaneous generation. Okay. Which was that disease just happens. It just appears. We have no reason. So by disproving spontaneous generation, he then supported the germ theory just through his research. And the first anesthetic that we used was cocaine. So the Indians of the Andes used to chew cocoa leaves for its medicinal effects, and it would increase endurance. We know that cocaine is a stimulant, so of course it increases endurance, okay? Cocaine is the active ingredient in the cocoa leaves. And then in 1884, Carl Kohler used it as an anesthetic in the eye. So it numbed the eye, and he was able to do whatever surgery, which, the thought of eye surgery in the 1880s makes my stomach hurt. Can't even imagine. But I'm glad that they had cocaine to put in the eyes. We now have derivatives of that we use pretty regularly. We don't prescribe cocaine to anybody anymore, but we will use procaine, which is Novocaine for dental surgery, and lidocaine to numb an area, and it stays in a local area. So anytime you see this, let me find my cursor here. Anytime you see this cane, the CAINE, you know that it's a cocaine derivative. Insulin was discovered in 1921. We found that if you extracted it, you could lower blood sugar in dogs, which is good. Okay, a lot of diabetics are alive today because of the discovery of insulin. So in 1922, James Collip had developed a pure extract that he tested on humans, and it was successful, and it changed diabetes. It changed how we manage diabetes. It changed the outcome for people who were born diabetic, for people who developed diabetes. This is a really important thing, okay? It really increased the quality of life for diabetics. Okay. Penicillin, I think we're all pretty familiar with it being the first antibiotic. That was Alexander Fleming who discovered it. It is the first antibiotic drug. We had Pfizer, and you'll notice the more time you spend in medicine, the fewer companies there are that that produce these drugs. A lot of companies merge and split and merge and split and craziness, but there's really only a few big companies, and Pfizer's one of them. They developed a method to mass produce it, and then it was used to save lives during World War. No doubt about it, penicillin is a miracle drug. We overused it because it cured so many things. We overused it, and now we're dealing with the backlash of that because now we have resistant bacteria, and we have people who've developed allergies to penicillin. But this truly was a lifesaver when it first came out. In 1943, we had birth control. It did not look like that picture in the upper right corner. Progesterone is actually naturally occurring in our body, so this statement is kind of misleading. Russell Marker didn't create progesterone. He created a synthetic version of progesterone, and this became the first reliable birth control. It was officially introduced in 1960, which started the whole sexual revolution for women. It is derived from a species of the Mexican yam. Okay. Before birth control, women would use this. They would dry it, and they would then cook it and reduce it to a syrup, and that's what they used for birth control. Now we're talking about more recent history, even though I know 60 years ago doesn't seem recent, but considering we've been talking about thousands of years ago, this is pretty recent. In 1951, we had Watson and Crick, who identified the structure of DNA, also a game changer. Before they discovered it, we had no idea of genetic diseases. We didn't know how to treat them. This was a big, big deal for them to identify the structure of DNA. And now we all have a basic understanding of DNA and how it works. Okay. In 1955, Dr. Jonas Salk developed the polio vaccine, the injectable polio vaccine, also a game changer. Probably a lot of our grandparents were affected by polio or know somebody who was affected by polio. This was an awful, awful disease, crippled and killed a lot of people. So Dr. Salk is a hero among that generation. In 1957, we have an oral polio vaccine that is using a weakened live virus. We have to be careful with using live viruses, even if they're attenuated. The word attenuated means weakened. We're presenting the body with a pathogen that is far too weak to create the disease, but it's just enough for the immune system to recognize it as a pathogen and build an antibody against it. The reason we have to be careful with live vaccines, and we have very few of them now, but the reason we have to be careful is people who are immunosuppressed, like people with cancer or HIV or who've had transplants, people who are immunosuppressed, their immune system may not actually be strong enough to build the antibodies, and the people may get the disease instead. But like I said, we have very few live vaccines anymore. Almost everything is attenuated. Almost everything is killed, not attenuated. Okay. Because of the risk of the disease, with it being an attenuated live virus, after they used it about 2,000 times, after the year 2000, we only used the injectable form. I remember they used to put a drop of this oral vaccine on a sugar cube and give kids sugar cubes. But being a live virus, even if it's attenuated, there still runs the risk of the person getting the disease. So the killed vaccines are the way to go. Okay. 1981 was our first documented case of AIDS, which again changed the face of medicine. We have some events throughout history that change and challenge everything that we know about medicine, and HIV/AIDS is one of them. It took 6 years for the first HIV drug to be approved, which is super fast. For the FDA to get something approved to market in 6 years is astounding. Okay. In 1996, so 15 years later, we had the highly active antiretroviral therapy that was introduced for AIDS treatment. Okay. It's a combination of at least 2 drugs. And what it did was it slowed the progress of HIV. So that combination of drugs decreased AIDS death by 47%. Now, we know we cannot cure HIV or AIDS, but we can slow the progression of the disease now for decades. At the time, it was the kiss of death. If you were diagnosed with HIV, it was a death sentence. Now we can prolong it, and most people who are HIV positive can live a fairly normal life. Okay. The Human Genome Project was started in 1988. So once we understood what DNA was and how it worked, which we had an idea in the past with genetics, and people were breeding animals for certain characteristics, but they didn't quite understand how it worked. Once we identified DNA, that really exploded the science behind it. So 35 years or so after we identified DNA, we started the Human Genome Project, which was to map the entire DNA sequence in the human genome. The reason for this was to develop an understanding of hereditary diseases and then to develop treatments for them, which is pretty cool. honestly. Every cell in our body is affected by our DNA. So it's a pretty big project, but they started it and they completed it. In 1996, we cloned Dolly, who was a sheep who was cloned from an adult cell. Dolly lived about 7 years, which is pretty good. Gardasil was marketed in 2006 as the first vaccine to target a cause of cancer. And remember that Gardasil is only against high-risk HPV strains. In 2008, Japanese scientists used 4 artificial bases to make an artificial DNA molecule, which is pretty cool. Kind of scares the bejesus out of me, but it's pretty cool. You know, that sounds like a Hollywood thing and terrifies me just a little bit. In the 20th century, the lifespan in the US has increased. In the 1900s, early 50s was when people would die. Now our average lifespan is well into the 70s, which is pretty incredible. We're living way longer than we were in the 1900s. And a lot of that is due to better nutrition, better sanitation, and better medication. So we can't just look at this and say, oh, medicine has saved all these people. It's a combination of things. We are, our pollution is low. Our food is full of preservatives, but we're still healthier than we used to be. We're less likely to die of a disease than we were in the 1900s. We're less likely to die because we were exposed to the elements in the 1900s. So there are a lot of factors that go into play with us living longer, but medicine is a big part of that. Like I said, medicine's a big part of it. The dramatic growth in pharmaceutical medicine and vaccines. We now have vaccine preventable diseases, and as long as people continue to get vaccinated, we can avoid those outbreaks. Okay. Since we had drugs that were powerful, let's say laudanum, okay, it became important to regulate them. And in the video that we will watch on Thursday, you will understand more why regulation became so important. The FDA was established to regulate the sale and use of medication in the US. We have an NDA, a new drug application, that has to be submitted to the FDA. It regulates drug manufacturing, regulates over-the-counter drugs, prescription drugs, the pregnancy categories, controlled substances, and probably most important, the FDA ensures that drugs that are prescribed are safe and effective. Now, I know if you watch 5 minutes of TV, you're going to see ads for attorneys who are trying to get you in on a class action lawsuit because this drug was not safe, or this drug did this or that or the other thing. But the reality is most of the drugs that are on the market are safe. It's just that not everybody's built the same. So some people are more sensitive to drugs than other people. Okay. So the FDA, I wanted to point out here that this yellow thing, this yellow pie, are medical devices. People forget that the FDA also regulates things like hospital beds and wheelchairs and prostheses. Okay. Most of what it does is, the big blue piece of the pie here is regulating food. This purple piece are the drugs, and then the medical devices, and then it's broken into other pieces. Animal drugs and foods, that's a small percentage. So the FDA regulates things for humans and animals, and then also the medical devices. I wanted to make sure to point that out to you so that you remember that. Okay. The primary responsibility of the FDA is to enforce the law and create regulations to assist in providing the public with safe drugs. It requires all manufacturers to file applications for investigational studies and approval of new drugs. That's the NDA. I was talking about the new drug application. So the thing is that the FDA regulates the drugs themselves, but has no legal authority over the practice of pharmacy. Okay, so the pharmacy profession itself is regulated by the State Board of Pharmacy. The FDA regulates the product. The State Board of Pharmacy regulates how the product is used. Okay. Part of the NDA and the clinical trials, part of the reason for that is that it's monitored by the FDA. We need to know there are several different trials. We'll talk about that. We need to test for safety. We have to test for efficacy. We have to test on healthy individuals. We have to test on non-healthy individuals. And then we have to do continual long-term testing and data gathering of all medication. And the FDA monitors all of that. Okay. After a drug is approved to go to market, then the FDA still continues to monitor that, and it's called post-marketing surveillance. So there are medications that have been released, they've passed all of the clinical trials, they get released to the general public, and now we find issues because the population pool or the test pool is so much bigger. And that happens sometimes, and usually the company will voluntarily recall a medication if after it goes to market they realize that, oh, there is a problem here. Usually the pharmaceutical house will go ahead and recall that. Okay. Recalls can occur because of the market, the reports, post-surveillance reports. It can be prescription or over-the-counter medication. We can take reports from public or healthcare professionals to remove a drug from the market. And then any adverse drug effects need to be reported to the manufacturer or to the FDA. So if there is something that needs to be recalled, the FDA contacts the manufacturer. Then the manufacturer contacts the wholesalers, retailers, and all consumer levels. If a patient is taking the medication that is being recalled, they actually get a phone call or a letter sent to them. We list the recalls publicly, and then we have a weekly FDA enforcement report that would also list that. So when something is recalled from the market, it is done fairly quickly. Think of it as like the food recall. If you've seen any food recalls on the news, it happens pretty fast. And the same thing with removal of a drug from a market. Once they decide to remove a drug from the market, they move pretty quickly for that. There are different types of recalls. Class 1 is serious adverse effects or death. Okay. Class 2 can cause temporary but reversible effects. And Class 3 is not likely to cause adverse effects. They may be recalling it for other reasons. Pay attention to these recalls because the video that we will watch on Thursday has a recall, and I want you to decide which one of these that recall would be. If you look at the Gallup poll from 2008, look at how many people, well, how many health people are in the top 5 trusted professions: nurses, pharmacists, doctors, police officers, and clergy. Now, 11 years later, would I say that, I'm sorry, not 11 years, 9 years later, has this changed a little bit? Yes. But I'm going to say that pharmacists themselves tend to be trusted. It's the pharmaceutical companies that people don't trust. But a lot of people really trust their nurses and pharmacists. And of course, their doctors, but I think that trust has eroded just a little bit. Okay. In 10 years, between 97 and 2007, the number of prescriptions increased by 72%, which is a huge increase. Okay. We know, if you had me in class last mod, you know that our healthcare, the cost of healthcare is greatly increasing. From the 1970s to 2010, it's increased $2,500. Part of that is that we are increasing the number of prescriptions, and there's a whole lot more drugs on the market than there were in the 1970s. And then just a little snarky, just a little snarky cartoon here. All right. That I'm going to end this Zoom session here. This will be the last one. We will pick up on Thursday with the second lecture and the math lecture. And of course, we're going to watch that video I talked about. It's an excellent video called The Elixir of Death. And that should underscore some of these regulations that we're going to be talking about, or that we have talked about. All right, so look for your Zoom quiz. I will post it up in modules, and that must be completed before class time on Thursday so that you can get attendance for this class. All right, hope you guys all have a great Halloween, and I will see you on Thursday.